Tonight, Trudeau tells his side.
There was an erosion of trust, and I wish I had known about it earlier.
Regret, lessons learned, but no apology. So will it be enough to calm the SNC controversy?
His entire business model is based on owning and controlling and exploiting our data.
Facebook promises change to protect your privacy. Why experts aren't buying it.
It's unbelievable that we are literally just numbers on a spreadsheet to them.
Growing outrage in Ontario over changes to autism funding. Parents tell us what it means for their kids. This is The National.
After conflicting testimony, the loss of a top advisor and 2 cabinet ministers, anything the Prime Minister has to say would get attention. But as the SNC-Lavalin affair has spiraled, we've heard just snippets from Justin Trudeau until now.
This has been a tough few weeks.
Tonight, you'll hear Trudeau's version and the response from voters across the country. We'll also look at the controversial deal still on the table for SNC-Lavalin.
A company facing serious criminal charges.
And at issue, tracks Trudeau's changing narrative. But first, what the Prime Minister said from David Cochrane.
He came to talk about SNC-Lavalin, but not to say he was sorry.
In regards to standing up for jobs and defending the integrity of our rule of law, I continue to say that there was no inappropriate pressure.
It was more an act of explanation than contrition, perhaps best described as an expression of regret.
I can tell you without a doubt that I have taken and will continue to take many lessons from these recent days and weeks.
No inappropriate pressure, he says, just strong disagreement and intense misunderstanding.
I said to her that I was preoccupied by the number of jobs involved in this.
Trudeau gave his side of a critical September 17th conversation with Jody Wilson-Raybould, where she says the Prime Minister crossed the line by raising political concerns and SNC-Lavalin.
At that point, the Prime Minister jumped in, stressing that there is an election in Quebec and that, quote, I am an MP in Quebec, the member for Papineau, end quote.
Trudeau conceded for the first time that this was true, but says he was worried about SNC jobs, not his own. He pointed to that conversation as the start of a politically devastating misunderstanding.
She indicated to me that she had made a decision. I asked her if she could revisit that decision, if she was open to considering, to looking at it once again, and she said that she would.
After that, Trudeau insists Wilson-Raybould never told him she wasn't changing her mind, so his staff kept asking her about it.
She did not come to me, and I wish she had.
A communication breakdown he blames on a loss of trust.
And that is certainly something that I'm having to reflect on as a leader and that I'm looking forward to improving on as we go forward.
It's now beyond dispute that he and his office bullied and threatened Ms. Wilson-Raybould in an attempt to get her to let SNC-Lavalin off the hook.
Nothing the Prime Minister said convinced the opposition.
We didn't see an apology. We didn't see really an admission of fault. We saw kind of a sidestep.
But Trudeau is trying to convince Canadians they can still trust his government. He's going to hire outside experts to review many things, including the role of the Attorney General and the way his office interacts with Cabinet.
Being able to demonstrate that we continue to defend our institutions despite internal challenges is something that I think Canadians can deeply be reassured by.
That's the hope in an election year, that despite a month of controversy and 2 cabinet resignations, Canadians will believe that everything is fine. David Cochrane, CBC News, Ottawa.
Of course, none of this would be happening if not for SNC-Lavalin and what's called a Deferred Prosecution Agreement, or DPA. Former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould said she felt she was pressured to give one to the engineering giant. And as Salima Shivji explains, it could still get one.
The Prime Minister today repeated what he said before.
The decision around a DPA is not mine to make.
But then Justin Trudeau clarified why his government felt it was okay to keep talking about a deferred prosecution agreement as a possible way forward for engineering firm SNC-Lavalin.
The terms of the DPA indicates that decision can be taken by the Attorney General up until the very last minute of a trial.
He's right on that point. It's similar to a plea deal. Companies can pay a fine and avoid more serious penalties to encourage them to clean up their act. And it's still an option. The new Attorney General has said as much, even though it has plunged the Liberal government into a political scandal.
In an inappropriate effort to secure a deferred prosecution agreement with SNC-Lavalin.
How could it happen when SNC-Lavalin is still facing a criminal trial alleged to have bribed Libyan officials over a 10-year period? The former Attorney General may have shut the door and refused to intervene after the Public Prosecutor's Office had decided last October SNC was not going to get a deferred agreement. But we don't know what criteria led to that decision. The engineering firm quickly filed an appeal in federal court. That decision is pending and could go in the company's favor if it meets the terms laid out in the law. This expert thinks there is a path forward for SNC-Lavalin to get a deal if the focus shifts.
What the PMO is hanging their hat on is this notion of innocent parties being harmed. That is one argument, but that quickly can tip into a political argument. So the path forward is not to continue to emphasize jobs. The path forward is to continue to emphasize the significant corporate governance and management reforms that SNC-Lavalin has undertaken.
But the question is, do the Liberals dare? The political risk is high. It could be seen as proof the government wanted the former Attorney General out of the way to clear the way for a DPA. Salima Shivji, CBC News, Ottawa.
So those SNC-Lavalin headlines have dropped like hammers on the government. The polls, not encouraging right now, but of course numbers only tell you so much. So we spoke to a range of Canadians in 3 parts of this country to get a sense of what voters think.
What is this really about?
We really don't have the full truth yet, and I think a lot of facts are being thrown around.
We have a strong line that's supposed to be drawn between the independence of the judiciary and all this and the executive government. I think that seeing that this line is kind of blurred is really unfortunate.
I think our governmental system is perfectly fine the way it is. I don't think there's need for huge reforms. So it's not a democracy issue, an ethical issue for sure.
It's not just a matter of feminism or Trudeau not matching his marketing face, right? It's the bigger picture.
This is the first federal election that I'll be voting in, but I've lost a little bit of trust in the Liberals because of this.
How do you think the Prime Minister has handled this?
I was disappointed when I heard it, for sure. I didn't vote for him myself, so I voted Conservative. Would have loved to have seen Harper stay in office, right? So hopefully it's the last straw, and when re-election comes, he's out the door.
At this point, I think that's the best he could do because he's trying to save face and trying to get on with the show and save all the seats.
Frankly, it's time for a change. They need someone of my generation, of your generation, not Trudeau.
What's your appetite for politics these days?
He's doing a fair job. I mean, he hasn't done badly.
Do you think it will affect your vote?
I have always been a Liberal. I have always voted Liberal, and I do not think I'm going to deviate from that norm. However, I will give due consideration to, in my riding, who the candidate is.
I don't think Trudeau will be in as much trouble as most people think, and I could be all wrong, but that's my...
Who do you believe?
Trudeau.
This is not going to go away. This is not going to be something that they look at and go, okay, we're done with this. There's too many unanswered questions.
Do you think it'll affect the way you vote?
Oh, I'm worried about that. I mean, it's like the devil you know and the devil you don't. Well, we know him. Who else is going to come up, and are they going to be a worse cover-up? So Yeah, it might. I think generally it's going to affect the vote, but it won't affect my vote.
We'll have more on the impact of Trudeau's statement today of regret. With At Issue, they are here again, and we'll talk to them in about 20 minutes' time. So, Ian, there was no clear contrition in Ottawa this morning, but the Prime Minister was expected to offer an official apology on a different matter in Iqaluit this afternoon.
Rosie, Justin Trudeau planned to apologize for the way the government treated Inuit people during tuberculosis outbreaks decades ago. But his long-anticipated trip to Canada's north has been put off for now, and here's why. A severe winter storm with heavy winds and poor visibility kept Trudeau's plane from landing at the Iqaluit airport. The Prime Minister's office says they'll try again tomorrow morning. From the 1940s through to the 60s, nearly half of Inuit in the eastern Arctic were separated from their families and taken to southern Canada for treatment of TB, a contagious bacterial infection of the lungs that spread through the air. They were often moved without their consent, often with no notice, never to come back. This is a painful subject for many Inuit. Families have been pushing for decades to have the government deliver the apology. Our David Common traveled to Iqaluit to hear some of their stories.
Across the windswept Arctic, the apology has long been sought, a recognition of ongoing pain.
They were not allowed to go back to their home without saying goodbye or pick up a few things. When the doctor said, you have TB, you're not getting off the ship.
Many in Joannasia Kumalak's family boarded that ship, moved south for treatment, held for a year or more, often kept in bed the entire time, their families rarely told where they'd gone. Many never came back, including Joannasia's grandfather.
It took me a couple of years to find the cemetery, talk to people from the hospital.
Knowing the pain from lack of closure, Akumalak found the grave in Ontario, bringing his dad and uncle to see their father.
My dad and my uncle cried and cried and cried because this was the first time that they have seen their father's grave. Their dad left and he never returned. And my father has been hurt by it because all the things that they lived through before all came back to him.
Eva Ariak was Nunavut's second premier, but remembers that ship well. Her grandmother died after being taken away, where no one knows exactly. Then her mother was taken, leaving her at 10, the eldest child, to help run the home.
By losing someone, either your father or your siblings or your mother, at a young age can be traumatic.
TB is still a problem in the north. A year ago in Qikiqtarjuaq, 1 in 10 people was found to be infected with active TB. It's often considered a poor country's disease, the result of a housing crisis, too few homes, and too many people in them.
If you have 20 people living in a 3 or 4 bedroom house, that means 4 or 5 people are sharing a bedroom, sleeping in shifts and in very close quarters. It makes it much more likely for tuberculosis to spread.
And that is a long-standing problem, something no apology can cure. David Common, CBC News, Iqaluit.
As part of the apology, the Prime Minister is also expected to launch a database of 4,500 Inuit patients' grave sites. That will help families find loved ones who died when they were sent south for TB treatment.
If you were to describe your Facebook experience right now, you probably wouldn't use the words like private, secure, or temporary. But according to its founder, that is where the company is headed. Facebook's brand has taken a hit after repeated privacy lapses, including data mining firm Cambridge Analytica improperly accessing user information. But Mark Zuckerberg says privacy will be at the forefront of the company's next steps. In a very long post, he said he wants to shift Facebook's focus from public communications to private, secure messaging. Among Zuckerberg's goals, encrypting messages so that even Facebook can't see them, making messages disappear after a period of time, and better linking Messenger, WhatsApp, and Instagram so you can use one to talk to another. But as Stephen D'Souza tells us, the critics, of course, are skeptical.
It's going to take some time to work through all the changes we need to make, but I'm committed to getting this right.
Mark Zuckerberg has promised to fix Facebook before, but data privacy advocate Shane Green says the latest one, to make the platform more private and secure, doesn't inspire much confidence.
Mark Zuckerberg has, spent the last 10 years figuring out how much he can get away with violating our privacy. So this is not somebody who has credibility on this subject. And in fact, the bigger problem is that his entire business model is based on owning and controlling and exploiting our data.
Facebook has been under increased pressure over how it gathers and sells users' information. Green says Zuckerberg was vague about how they'll make money going forward, but he expects things won't change.
They don't plan on changing their monetization model. It's very much going to be about owning and controlling data as it relates to the core Facebook service.
Zuckerberg says they're focusing on private messaging because that's what people want. But critics suspect it's also about fending off government regulators, worried that Facebook controls too much. While Europe has brought in stricter rules, this professor says lawmakers in the U.S. shouldn't let Facebook try and solve its own problems.
I just don't think Facebook is particularly altruistic. At the end of the day, they have an obligation to shareholders, and they're thinking about that.
There's another concern for Facebook, too, the number of people logging off for good. A recent study estimates it's lost 15 million users in the U.S. in the last 2 years.
A lot of young people used to use Facebook. That's changed, and I think it's going to continue to change.
Both experts agree the key for Facebook to recover is being transparent and earning back users' trust, something they say will take more than just the promise of more privacy. Stephen D'Souza, CBC News, New York.
Facebook is also taking aim at the anti-vaccination movement by banning their ads, and that's one of the stories we're watching tonight. The move comes after growing scrutiny of how social media helps spread misinformation. Pinterest banned promotion of anti-vax advice in 2017, and YouTube pulled ads with false vaccine claims earlier this year. Paul Manafort has been sentenced to nearly 4 years in prison. Donald Trump's former campaign chair was convicted last August of hiding millions of dollars that he received for political consulting in Ukraine. Bank and tax fraud were uncovered during the Russia investigation. Next week, Manafort is set to be sentenced in another case where he pleaded guilty to conspiracy against the United States and to obstruct justice. A judge will decide then whether the two sentences will be served consecutively or at the same time. A lawsuit by the adult film actress Stormy Daniels has been dismissed by a U.S. federal judge. She was trying to terminate a non-disclosure agreement that she signed, which prevents her from discussing her alleged sexual relationship in 2006 with Trump. The U.S. president has denied having an affair with her.
Still ahead on the National, at issue on SNC-Lavalin. Was Trudeau's explanation today enough?
Later, fighting Ebola in a war zone, the deepening crisis in Central Africa.
But next, the growing outrage over Ontario's change to its autism program.
This is a medically necessary treatment that Elliot needs in order to thrive in life. And as it stands, I can't provide the medication that he needs.
Bonnie and Clyde did everything while robbing banks, but nothing quite like this. The details are still sketchy, but today's bank robbery by land and air in Montreal goes something like this. Just before 11 this morning, a man and a woman hired a helicopter from Olympic Helicopters Limited on Laurentian Boulevard in suburban Saint Laurent. They wanted to fly to Quebec City, they said, and the man paid $630 cash for 2 one-way tickets. But on the way to Quebec City, the man pulled an automatic weapon and ordered the pilot to land in the field near the Francon Quarry in Saint-Michel. Once on the ground, the bearded young blonde gunman began slapping decals marked police on the helicopter's windshield. The pilot, a Vietnamese named Ngo Ho Lee, tried to escape, but his passengers fired off a quick round of machine gun bullets and he changed his mind. He was handcuffed to the helicopter and ordered to change course to west. Minutes later, Pilot Lee dropped down on the parking lot of the Place Vertu shopping center in Saint Laurent. Police say the man and the woman and the pilot then entered the Royal Bank of Canada branch located in the shopping complex. The two passengers, both English-speaking, then apparently robbed the bank of an undetermined amount of cash before climbing aboard the Jet Ranger helicopter and heading east. About 5 minutes later, Lee put his helicopter down in the middle of busy Sauve Street near the metro station. His gun-wielding passengers got out and ran for the metro, but before they vanished among the passengers, the man turned and fired 3 quick rounds from his automatic weapon, but he missed Pilot Lee. The 33-year-old Lee, still handcuffed to the controls, got the chopper up and returned to base. Tonight, MUC police officers are looking for the man and the woman who pulled off one of the city's most spectacular robberies. Frank Roach, CBC News, Montreal.
Our son is on the spectrum, and we want to be here to support all the other parents.
It's overwhelming to see the amount of people that are going to be affected by this decision. They're going to send us all into crisis.
Emotions running high at the Ontario legislature. Parents and advocates angry at the Ford government's changes to autism programs coming into effect April 1st. Much of that anger has been aimed at the minister responsible for the file, Lisa MacLeod. She didn't attend today's rally after threats were made against her, and today, Ottawa police arrested someone they say is responsible. The government says it's trying to tackle long wait lists for therapy, but parents believe the changes are going to make it much harder to get children the treatment they need. And the impact? Families say it's going to be devastating. Our Joanna Remiliotis spoke with some of them.
You're okay. Ready? Show me 6. That's 3.
It can be frustrating and painstakingly slow, but the promise is there.
Can you do this? Up here.
Elliot Heineke is 4.5 and is just starting to speak.
This piece goes here.
It's taken hours of behavioral therapy to get to this point.
What's this? Shark?
And he needs
Push.
so much more. Elliot should be getting more than 20 hours of therapy a week.
High five. Yeah.
But his parents can only afford 6. Jessica Knoll says it breaks her heart that she can't do more.
It's awful. Imagine only being able to feed your child 1 meal a day when you know they need 3. This is a medically necessary treatment that Elliot needs in order to thrive in life. And as it stands, I can't provide the medication that he needs.
The diagnosis of severe autism, a neurological disorder that affects communication, was devastating.
Good job. Whoa,
The attempt to treat it has been too.
We've cashed out our RSPs, we've cashed out our savings, we've remortgaged the equity in our house. My husband literally works as many possible hours as he can. It's all done on that basis of like, if you tread enough water, eventually you'll be able to swim to shore. And I can't see the shore anymore.
Elliot was waiting for publicly funded therapy, but Ontario's new plan is scrapping the wait list and giving families money to pay for treatment themselves. But the math doesn't add up.
Got some numbers here, some really sad numbers about what we're actually going to receive once the new AP goes into effect. So we're looking at $71.35 a week.
$71.35 a week.
$71.35, so not even enough to cover 2 hours of therapy.
My son Elliot is one of the 25,000.
Jessica is just one parent desperate to reveal what's at stake, a fighting chance for their kids. Maritza Bassaran put this video together.
I guess the goal of the video is to show the general public what Doug Ford and his minister were doing to clear the wait list. I mean, it's hard. Waiting is never fun. But, you know, I was willing to wait if it meant that one day my son was going to get needs-based service.
What is it that you want these politicians to see?
We're human. These are our children. This is our life. I will do anything to help my son, obviously.
Autism is a spectrum disorder. Toby Riley's son and every child in this room has different levels of needs. But the new program decides funding based on age and family income. The most any child will receive is $140,000 over a lifetime.
Hey, let's go! Right?
That would cover a little over a year of therapy for Lisa Yakeley's daughter.
It's unbelievable that we are literally just numbers on a spreadsheet to them.
Our children are just numbers.
Use your words. Use your words.
Daniela Tripolino says thousands of families will be left unable to pay for the therapy their kids need.
This was the light at the end of the tunnel. And to have that just ripped apart and taken away is really, really scary for us. It's really scary for us.
Miles, we need 5.
That despair is at the heart of the outrage, the loss of hope.
Here, you can see, need help. Sure.
This therapy is proven to help an autistic child like Miles develop everything from vocabulary to social skills.
What does this one say?
Squishy, squish.
Squishy squibbles. Here.
The whole point is to help him transition to a typical world.
What we want is a needs-based program that adequately meets all of our needs for all of our kids. We just want a seat at the table. Let us help them develop a better program.
Kids deserve better.
It's why his mom, Christine Clayton, and a group of parents in Ottawa show up here every week in front of the office of the minister responsible. To give up, they say,
I think she wants to be on TV.
means giving up on their children. And they simply refuse to do that. As for Elliot, there's no money for more therapy. But he just said daddy for the first time the other day. That keeps his parents going, even though they don't know where they'll end up. Joanna Rumiliotis, CBC News, Innisfil, Ontario.
After the break, at issue with their take on the Prime Minister's news conference today.
And later, the World Health Organization issues a dire warning about Ebola in Central Africa.
The existing atmosphere can only be described as toxic. 2 of our Ebola treatment centers in the epicenter of the outbreak were attacked.
Court delays have historically been a serious problem in Canada, with criminal trials that drag on and on and on. The situation finally came to a head in 2016 in a court ruling known as the Jordan decision. Named after Barrett Richard Jordan, a BC man who was accused of drug trafficking in 2008, it took 5 years before his case made it to the Supreme Court. Now, the Charter of Rights and Freedom says Canadians have the right to be tried in a reasonable time. Jordan and his lawyer argued that the delays in his case had contravened that fundamental right. The court agreed, and in its unanimous decision, tossed out Jordan's case. But then, the court went one monumental step further. It set concrete limits on what constitutes a reasonable time frame. 18 months for cases in the provincial court and 30 months for cases in the Superior Court. The move caused a stir, mostly because everyone thought those timelines were unrealistic. Everyone except the judges. In their decision, they criticized what they saw as a culture of complacency towards delay that had been accepted as the norm. So has Jordan really worked then to speed up the system? We spoke with lawyers across the country who say they've seen many changes. First, judges are triaging cases, and cases that are getting close to deadline are given priority. When scheduling trial dates, the court considers the deadline first and works backward from there. When the date is set, all the pretrial proceedings are squeezed into the months before to keep everything on schedule. Most lawyers told us there's a lot more pressure on everyone, Crown, defense, and judges, to make themselves available. Courtrooms are double, even triple booked, so that when one trial wraps up, the next one can begin right away. If and when either side delays proceedings for any reason, it is put on the record to document who caused the delay in case the trial goes over deadline. Even with all the adjustments, lawyers say there are still unforeseen setbacks. Adjournments, delayed evidence, witnesses who don't show up, judges who get sick. And multiple lawyers told us they're frustrated because simpler cases that would have been resolved in a matter of months before Jordan are now taking much longer because the whole system is stressed. In March of 2017, the Canadian Bar Association made suggestions on how to reduce court delays. Later that year, in June, a Senate report came out with 50 recommendations to improve the system. A main priority, to fill what the senators called the excessive vacancies of federally appointed judges. Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould has appointed dozens of judges, but vacancies still abound. As of March 2018, the minister still had 56 empty spots to fill, and a quarter of the nearly 1,200 sitting judges are already semi-retired. The minister's office told CBC she's committed to improving the system. She introduced legislation in March of 2018, but the courts will have to wait to see what effect it has on the problems. The Jordan deadlines may seem hard to reach, but it bears reminding that the Supreme Court judges told Canadians they shouldn't be satisfied even with these deadlines. In their words, this is a long time to wait for justice.
Here are some of the other stories we're watching tonight. A day after the head of Quebec's provincial police force, Martin Prudhomme, was suspended, 2 officers have been put on administrative duties. Yesterday, Radio-Canada reported the initial suspension has to do with allegations of leaks in an investigation by the province's anti-corruption unit looking into political party financing under the former premier, Jean Charest. Celebrated Canadian poet Patrick Lane has died. He wrote dozens of poetry collections, earning a number of awards. In 2014, he was made an officer in the Order of Canada. Lane suffered a heart attack this morning at his home in Victoria, British Columbia. He was 79.
The allegations in the Globe story this morning are false. Her presence in cabinet should actually speak for itself. I continue to be puzzled and obviously disappointed by her decision to step down from cabinet. We believe in the independence of the judiciary, and we believe in fighting for good jobs, and we will always do that in the right way. I strongly maintain, as I have from the beginning, that I and my staff always acted appropriately and professionally. Over the past months, there was an erosion of trust between my office, and specifically my former principal secretary, and the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
So the Prime Minister's narrative has changed over the past month since the SNC-Lavalin story first broke. But today, Justin Trudeau gave his first full press conference all about this issue and expressed some regret. Was it enough? It's Thursday and At Issue is back. This is our regular time slot. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Vancouver tonight, and Chachi Curl is in Toronto with us. Okay, I thought it was very effective to see those different clips just over the past month in terms of how the answers have shifted a little bit. Let's just start with today. When we were sort of warned or told that we might get some sort of act of contrition or message of contrition, I'm not sure that that's what I expected. Chantal, what did you make of it?
I thought the contrition thing was out the window after I listened to Gerald Butt's narrative yesterday, because and the clerk of the Privy Council and the Deputy Minister of Justice, all three agreed that they felt that nothing inappropriate had taken place. I had a hard time seeing how Justin Trudeau could come and nail down a narrative that would have had a major act of contrition if no one regrets anything major in this story. So I thought format counts, and the fact that the press conference took place in a setting that looked less on the fly probably will help. I'm not sure that the content of what Mr. Trudeau had to say resists analysis, but I think we can take the message from it that the government, after all this, has come down to a narrative, and they will hang on to it now, come hell or high water.
So it seemed like the language from that, this was about lessons learned, Andrew, and when he was asked very directly if he was apologizing for anything today, he said, I am just going to continue to say there was no inappropriate pressure. Were those kinds of answers enough for what he needed to do today?
It depends what your strategy is. I mean, their strategy, as Chantal says, is to stonewall in committee, to admit no serious fault. I mean, he treated it as if it was just kind of an HR problem with a couple of squabbling employees, but not anything, nobody done anything actually wrong, nothing he had to apologize or even take responsibility for, certainly not explain in any detail. So that, I agree, is probably the message they're going to stick with. It's rather than admitting they did anything wrong, they are certainly admitting to everything that Jody Wilson-Raybould said they did, I mean, except for a couple of things, a couple of the more incriminating quotes. But in the broad particulars, yeah, they're saying, yeah, we did it, but we had good reasons to do it. We were saving jobs, or she wasn't up to the job, or whatever their excuse is going to be. They're basically trying to normalize their behavior rather than apologizing for it.
But they did, to be fair, they did say we're going to go seek some advice on whether the AG and the Justice Minister roles should be divided. We're going to seek some advice on how we deal with these matters with our office. Is that not an admission in some way that they realize that maybe things weren't done exactly as they should have been? Is that not how you read that?
That would be the logical implication, but they will certainly not acknowledge that. They will certainly not admit that. And if pressed, they will say we were just trying to save jobs.
Okay, Chantal, yeah, go ahead, Chantal, quickly.
And in acknowledging the same basic facts, what they are doing is protecting the PMO and the Prime Minister from a second Jody Wilson-Raybould appearance, because they have not given her a lot of facts to say this is not true, since they bought into her facts.
Shachi, how do you think what the message he delivered translated today?
Well, this is about trying to turn the page, and Justin Trudeau and his government would like to be talking about anything other than this right now. So we started to see a little bit of the jobs, jobs, jobs refrain and mantra in earlier statements. I think we heard a lot about it from Gerald Butts yesterday. If you missed it, he's happy to tell you about it again. And then the big double down on the gamble that the Canadian public will be more accepting of and find a message that resonates better on defending jobs than it does on, hey, actually, it turns out that I am not Mr. Empathy. I'm actually not a great manager, and I'll do better on the shop floor next time. That's not the statement that people really want to hear. It certainly, as we've talked about at length, continues to be a confirmation that his own brand is damaged around this. So, you know what? Forget about that story, Canadians. Focus on a new story.
So when he said today, I wish Jody Wilson-Raybould would have come to me and told me these things, and he talked about, he needs to have better communication between caucus and cabinet, and he talked about an erosion of trust. Does that not speak to his leadership, though? I mean, it seemed curious to me that all the onus was being put on everybody else for not coming to him, and maybe he's just not that kind of manager. I don't know, but Andrew, how did you read that?
Absolutely, because she did come to him. She came to the clerk. She came to the Minister of Finance. She talked to two of his officials in the Prime Minister's office. She talked to Butts. So this narrative that she never told anybody anything is just absolutely out the window, unless they're going to pretend that she's made all of these quotes up. Maybe they are, but they don't want to say so because, that gets them into dangerous territory as well. So, yeah, there was a pretty broad-scale effort, if you believe Jody Wilson-Raybould's testimony, and they seem to have acknowledged it without admitting any kind of culpability. There was a pretty broad-range effort to try and get her to change her mind or to move her off her position or what have you. That is set at the top. The culture that says, independence of the Attorney General, independence of prosecutorial discretion, these are not really fundamental principles. They're kind of contingent on whether we need to get elected or whether we're worried about jobs or what have you. That culture is set from the top, and he absolutely should be accepting responsibility for that, and instead, as you say, basically treated as if it was a problem of quarrelsome employees.
Chantal.
I'm not going to go into legality versus public interest, but I do have the same problem with that section of the Prime Minister's statement, which is the core of his statement, and that is the notion that there was an erosion of trust, but not at his level, and so why did she not come to me? I was listening to that, and I remembered I was around, sadly, for my age, that when Lucien Bouchard resigned over something much bigger and in a way that was much more definitive. And he took time out to say Brian Mulroney's Palace Guard had isolated him from Brian Mulroney. He never, ever took shots at Brian Mulroney in the way that Jody Wilson-Raybould implicated the Prime Minister directly and personally. So I'd have to say, yes, if there was erosion of trust, that's probably true, but it starts at the top and not down the food chain.
Okay, so what happens next with this? I mean, Andrew Scheer came out again today saying, "Oh, I still think he should resign." It didn't. You know, he wasn't able to say much more. But I am perplexed as to how this story doesn't start losing steam next week. The House isn't sitting. There's no committee meeting. What does the opposition have to do? What kinds of things might they do to try and keep this this going and people thinking about it? Chachi, what do you think?
They don't have to do too much to keep this going. Remember that there is always the drip, drip, drip that comes from us talking about this, from the op-eds that are going to be written, from the social media posts that go on. And so there is almost a permanent virality to this story. So yes, a week gives the government a bit of breathing space, provided nothing else comes out. Goodness knows what else is going to come out at this point. You know, the conventional wisdom might be, well, the worst is over, but you never know. The other piece of it, of course, is that they have an opportunity to try and change the message, although, you know, today was an unfortunate example of trying to do that, and then in the end, the PM couldn't get up north to issue the apology on tuberculosis that he had wanted to do. That said, you know, for Andrew Scheer, there is a real moment here. There is a situation where his party is now leading in the polls. He has a chance to seize high ground on the trust issue, on the integrity issue, on the morality issue. So far, what we've seen him say is the Prime Minister must resign, and the Prime Minister says, no, I'm not going to do that. So I think it's time for him to start changing the message a little bit, less around what did you know, Prime Minister, and when did you know it, and more on taking his case directly to the electorate and saying, you know what, this guy can't be trusted. I can defend jobs and maintain the independence of the judicial system and not turn it into a mess.
Okay,
one, I think there is a real chance that Canadians are going to start tuning out. They're going to say, I heard this and I heard that. Two, I think there's a real risk for the opposition to continue to prosecute that to the expense of other issues. And one of the reasons for that is I remember, it's very recent, how good Thomas Mulcair was at prosecuting the Senate scandal in the House of Commons. But at the end of the day, I think that Thomas Mulcair only won a job demotion in opposition for that, and Andrew Scheer has to fit himself in the frame of Prime Minister, because once people, having seen all this, say, well, I'm not so sure that Justin Trudeau is the man for this. They're going to look at Andrew Scheer, and I don't think that he has fit himself in that frame. And to just count on people saying, we're not going to want Justin Trudeau because of SNC-Lavalin, and we're going to go to Andrew Scheer, I think there's a real risk for the opposition in that.
Andrew, last word to you on this.
I think this is a moment when the public interest and the opposition's political interest align, which is that we need answers and we need to get to the bottom of this. This is big stuff. This is not about games or jobs or managerial. It's about the integrity of our judicial and our prosecutorial system. We have got a system for looking into this through the Justice Committee that is deeply flawed. We've heard from Jody Wilson-Raybould once, but we've heard from Wernick twice. She was allowed to say some things. Jerry Butts was allowed to say much more. We haven't heard from all kinds of people who were deeply involved in this and could tell us much more. I don't think that this kind of stonewalling should be allowed to proceed. I think the opposition will be well within their rights to say we're going to hold up parliamentary proceedings until we get some answers and until we get a transparent process for digging into this.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to the two of you for coming 3 times. Chachi, thanks for coming out for the last edition this week. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast for extra content. This week, we're going to continue talking about the SNC-Lavalin crisis, and particularly about the use of those deferred prosecution agreements. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.
All right, from a political storm to an actual blizzard, our moment of the day is coming up.
Plus, you'd think in the age of 92, the Queen has done it all, but it seems this was still on her bucket list.
There we are. A letter from Prince Albert.
But first, a look at the Sunday interview. Andrew sits down with the host of this year's Juno Awards, Sarah McLachlan. They talked about that and the legacy of her festival, Lilith Fair, in the age of Me Too. Here's a preview.
thank God for Me Too, and thank God for women finally being able to stand up for themselves and start to feel that power that they intrinsically have. And I'm happy about it because we cannot be complacent. We can't rest in our laurels and think, oh yeah, it's equal now. You talk to, before Me Too, you talk to some young girls coming up in high school and they're like, oh yeah, we don't have to worry about that, everything's cool, everything's equal. It's so not. We've got such a long way to go. And this may sound shocking, but you know, Trump paved the way for all of this. His horrible behavior and the fact that it was accepted by so many people pissed women off to the point where we finally had enough and we had to do something about it.
It's the time of year when parents get time off from work and find a babysitter for the morning. 11 shopping days before Christmas. This week, News Magazine follows one couple on a present buying spree in a big Toronto store's Toyland. Not today, a family party with rides on the miniature Midway, but a secret expedition where only the Christmas savings go along. For the parents, months of savings go toward Christmas. For the store's toy department chief, months of careful planning. Now, as children of all ages gather and gaze at the piled-up counters, it's 0 hour for one of the biggest little industries in Canada, the toy industry. There's plenty of foreign competition. Trains all come from Germany, England, the States. The Canadian market isn't big enough to warrant home manufacture. Many metal toys are foreign, too. This idea comes from a firm in Nova Scotia. It's constructive, educational, and Canadian. It's cheap, too. A moment's consideration, and the decision's made. One problem solved, and a few more dollars added to the $50 million which Canadians spend every year on toys. But of that $50 million, over half is spent on imported toys. And this, in spite of the Canadian industry's ability to produce a good 90% of the country's needs. One worker in every 5 is out of a job. A situation which toy manufacturers uneasily compare with the Canadian textile industry's headaches. One of the headaches, American ability to mass-produce toys cheaply. Some manufacturers accuse their stateside rivals of dumping in Canada. There's an inflexible rule for sales in every industry. Best value for least money sells most. Canadian dolls compare favorably with imported dolls. They walk, talk, sleep, even cry. Their clothes come on and off. Are well made and pretty. Their hair can be brushed and rearranged. They're a delight for any little girl to have and to hold. But it's a fight to keep their price down to the level where the customer will say, I'll take this one. Shopping's all done. Time to leave the store. Time to look behind the scenes at a varied scene, typical of many Canadian industries, for enterprise, ingenuity, and struggle against difficult odds. This firm turns out close to $500,000 a year. It's unique practically the world over because it makes every one of the dozens of components assembled by expert fingers. Employees, mostly women, many of them immigrants, work here. The firm operates on a profit-sharing basis. Employees benefit in time of prosperity, even down to the bench hands, who give stylish hairdos to hundreds of dolls better than natural hair.
people are facing the biggest Ebola outbreak in the country's history.
That country is the Democratic Republic of Congo, and with nearly 600 dead, it is the second deadliest Ebola outbreak in the world. Treating Ebola is dangerous enough, making things even worse, a combat zone, and people who just don't trust those who are there to help. Iqaluit looks at that very big challenge.
In the crossfire between war and disease, armed rebels killed 9 people in this village near the border with Uganda. Then health workers spirited the bodies away to be tested for Ebola, creating resentment and mistrust.
We don't understand what this Ebola is. We can bury the bodies of our people ourselves.
Last week, tensions blew up when unknown attackers set fire to a pair of Ebola treatment centers. For local people, it's becoming less clear who's here to actually help.
The existing atmosphere can only be described as toxic.
Doctors Without Borders says this humanitarian mission is starting to feel like a military operation.
And all of a sudden, you're labeled with Ebola and you don't have no choice. You are put somewhere isolated. You're all of a sudden being cared by people with spacesuits and you don't have a say.
Rebel groups are fighting for control of this resource-rich part of Congo, so the Congolese military and police are now playing a bigger role in the Ebola response, sometimes using force. And as resentment from local people grows, aid workers are seeing a disturbing trend. They suspect some are hiding Ebola. Cases are coming out of nowhere.
35 to 40% of the people who are confirmed do not belong to the chain of transmission, meaning that we don't know where they get it.
It wasn't supposed to be like this. Congo has dealt with Ebola before, and aid workers now have a Canadian-developed Ebola vaccine. Last fall, this Toronto doctor worked for the WHO at both treatment centers that were recently destroyed.
Yeah, it's frustrating for sure for all of those that are involved. It's disappointing that there have been certain things that have conspired against the outbreak coming under control.
Doctors Without Borders says it needs to ensure the security of its workers before it can resume all of its work. It's also calling on all aid groups and the government to consult local people and help put the humanity back into the humanitarian mission. Iqaluit, CBC News, Toronto.
Up next, they may have been primed for the Prime Minister's visit in Iqaluit, but there are just some things you cannot control.
Yeah, we're in a full-blown blizzard. You can see the cars behind me are driving along with their four-ways flashing.
Our moment is coming up, but first. In case you missed it, that simple, hardly dramatic finger tap was actually history in the making. It just took a bit of a moment to happen.
There we are. A letter from Prince Albert.
And that applause is for the Queen's first ever Instagram post, made today at London's Science Museum. Her Majesty may be 92 years old, but the Queen has always been up for trying something new.
Today, we need a special kind of courage.
Like in 1957, when people watched her give her Christmas address on television for the very first time.
I hope that 1958 may bring you God's blessing and all the things you long for.
Or in 2008, when she went HD. In 2012, she went 3D, but that experiment, like the excitement over 3D TVs, was short-lived. And then there was the internet. Way back in 1976, she sent an email, and in 2014, a tweet. Which brings us back to today and that very first Instagram post. It's of a letter a computer pioneer sent to her great-great-grandfather back in 1843, embracing one tech moment by honoring another.
For several years, we automatically associated teenage drug use with hippies. But recent reports of drug use in small-town and suburban schools means we can no longer type the teenage user. And how many of us would recognize the drugs themselves? This happens to be marijuana in its natural state. Before a police raid on the illicit plot completed the cycle by burning the weed into smoke.
Dr. Lionel Solers is chairman of the Canadian Medical Association's Special
Committee on Drug Abuse. And I think, Dr. Sollers, what we need is a kind of primer on the drugs and how you can recognize them and what the effects are. Is marijuana still the one that's most commonly used?
I think just to keep it in perspective, there are two things that need to be said. One is that in all the surveys of drug use amongst youth, the commonest drug in use has been alcohol. Secondly, tobacco, roughly in 2/3 and at 50% of the population. Then with a quick drop to about 7 to 15% of our, say, high school population comes marijuana, and then the others. The other point that we're making time and again is that this is just the tip of an iceberg. We see it because it's in front of our nose, but this is an entire social problem. What about over-the-counter drugs, etc.? They account for many more hospital admissions than marijuana anywhere.
Well, I think we'll assume that people know about alcohol and about cigarettes, so let's move into the first category. Sure.
I gather that marijuana is really just one part of a larger family of so-called drugs.
Well, there's an entire group of drugs which could be loosely called youth drugs, which are illusinogenic or hallucinogenic in action. That is, they produce illusions, distortions of what you see or hear, or hallucinations, seeing or hear something that isn't there at all. One of the mildest, probably, is marijuana. And this includes a lot of other drugs, such as LSD, DMA, or MDA, sorry, TMA, various solvents that are inhaled, and so on. Yes.
But marijuana is a plant, isn't it?
It's a plant. Cannabis sativa is the name of the plant. And the mildest form of drug that can be prepared from it would be marijuana. It's the chopped up stems, leaves, that sort of thing, with the seeds filtered out, yes.
Well, you have some with you, so let's take a look at it so that anyone who finds it
could
looks, recognize it.
Let's see,
this is the actual bit of the dried plant here, eh?
That's a dried marijuana plant. Here is some marijuana, which is, it just looks like oregano or almost any chopped up
Yes, I was just
plant
going to say,
product.
it just looks like a herb you might use in the kitchen. There's no...
What distinguishes it probably is the smell and, of course, the chemical content. There are several substances which are probably active in that way.
You can smoke that?
You can smoke it rolled in a cigarette as if it were tobacco, or it can be mixed with tobacco. It can be boiled as in tea and drunk, or injected, as happened on occasion. It can be sniffed, usually smoked as a cigarette, yes.
You can put it in brownies, can't you? Alice B.
You can
Toklas
bake
had
it
a recipe.
in brownies or fudge. It's surprising that you would know this, but very interesting.
There was a movie made.
Alice B. Toklas' cookbook, yes.
This is CBC News.
If the story matters to you, you can always turn to us. CBC News, right where you are.
The Prime Minister wound up on the wrong tarmac today. As we told you earlier, Justin Trudeau was supposed to be in Iqaluit today to apologize for how Inuit were treated during the TB outbreak decades ago. But a blizzard got in his way, because even the Prime Minister can't do anything about that. The apology is important to many Inuit and even people across the North. Some traveled a great distance to be there, and our colleagues at CBC North were waiting along with everyone else, and they gave us a sense of what it was like, and that is our moment of the day.
Yeah, we're in a full-blown blizzard. The visibility is not good, certainly not enough for any airplanes to land.
We were told that part of the city has shut down, schools are shut down, stores are closing. People who were watching the documentary film here at the theater were asked to start heading home, getting family to pick them up. Some of the elders that were here were being driven back, that were waiting for the apology. Inuit went through tremendous pain and suffering when they needed to get treatment for TB back in the 40s and 50s. But even though it was that long ago, it still carries on to today. It affects us. It affects me.
So there were lots of people, obviously, who were there ready to go, have a feast and a celebration. It got canceled, but they weren't upset. They just are hopeful that it will happen.
And I know that there was disappointment that the Prime Minister didn't arrive, but you know, as someone who was watching this today and watching Pauline in particular there talk to us hour after hour, and the more she talked, the more the personal stories came out, and I think it actually did an incredible service to Canadians to explain the impact of TB. She was remarkable today.
So a remarkable story, and a chance tomorrow, I guess, is the plan for the Prime Minister to get up there again. But Rosie, as you said, I mean, people weren't mad because they understand blizzards in Iqaluit, and I mean, that is a blizzard on a level that most of us in the southern part of the country don't see. I took a peek at the forecast. That blizzard warning is about to end. It's going to be like -13 tomorrow.
Oh,
Just a
balmy.
tiny chance of precipitation. So looks like the Prime Minister will be able to land. That is the National for Thursday, March the 7th. Good night.